want to say thank you to Greg for reading that. We were talking a little bit before, and I had suggested that he do some of that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and I didn't think he would actually do it. So thank you for that. Not something that I would have been able to pull off, that's for sure. As a fun fact, and I think goes along with how he was doing, that is Psalm 113 is the first psalm that is used in the Passover celebration, part of the collection they use there. And I think you'll find tonight that what is in that psalm is going to prepare us. There's a lot of parallels for what we're going to talk about tonight. Certain themes and specific language that you'll see repeated. And I think it prepares our hearts to discuss what we're going to discuss. But tonight I want to start off by telling you a story of a woman that I know of. And the story starts off very painfully. So this woman desperately wanted to have a child, but she wasn't able to. And for years, some of her family would actually tease her because they had kids and she didn't. And when she would try to bring this before God, she was so deeply upset that her spiritual leaders once accused her of being drunk and disorderly. Can you imagine what she felt like? Alone, mistreated, misunderstood, ignored. And I'm talking about Hannah, the mother of the prophet Samuel. Hannah had been in a miserable situation. And God brought her out of it. She was childless and desperately wanted one. And the rival wife in the household had children, and she would rub it in Hannah's face just to pour salt in her wounds. So we see, for instance, in 1 Samuel chapter 1, and her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And she would pray to God and beg him for a son, to continue her line, to bring her honor in the eyes of their culture. And so, for instance, in 1 Samuel chapter 1, in verse 10, she is at the tabernacle, and in her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on her head. And so she was going to dedicate him to God if he would only give her to him. Give him to her. And we find even that her spiritual leaders mistreated her. We should remember in this context that Eli's sons were priests, and the things they were doing of stealing sacrifices and sleeping with women in the presence of the Lord. And we find also with Eli that as she is praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth, and it was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. And she responds, Not so, my Lord. Hannah replied, I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. It's easy to read that kind of stuff, but I think as we did in stating it as if it was somebody that we know in our time and place, you see that there is a lot that Hannah went through. Eventually it says in chapter 1 and verse 19 that God remembers her, and she had a son, Samuel. And when you get to chapter 2, which is where we're going to take our text for the night, 1 Samuel chapter 2, when she brings Samuel to dedicate him to God, she prays at Shiloh, where the tabernacle was, thanking God for what he's done in changing her circumstances and reflecting on how this shows the way that God often works in the world. And so we have this prayer. And I tried to get it on the slide. If you can read that, go ahead. If not, turn in your Bible to 1 Samuel chapter 2. I tried to fit that up there, but it didn't work probably. But it reads, "And Hannah prayed and said, 'My heart exults in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed." So if we look at the flow of this prayer and how to understand what is going on, we can see first that Hannah is talking about her own experience and what God did for Hannah. She then moves to what God does generally in the world in verses 4 through 8. And then she turns to look to the future of what God is going to do for his kingdom in the future. If you look at how this prayer seems to be structured, and the fact that the Lord, the name Yahweh, is the most common repeated word, it becomes clear that this prayer is primarily teaching about God. Not just personal reflection, but this is reflection on God and how he generally operates. And I think this is one of the great prayers of the Bible that I'm not sure gets as much attention as it deserves. But tonight we're going to learn from Hannah something about God. And first, let's look at the message of the prayer. So in the message of the prayer, and we think about the summary of it, the summary is that God is sovereign, that he can reverse fortunes, and he can vindicate the faithful, and that there is no one like him. And so some have commented that this prayer shows all of the basic central tenets of the Israelite faith. And I think that's correct. But we see first in verses 1 through 2 that Hannah is thankful for everything that God has done. And that is a central part of the message. She talks about rejoicing and being exalted by God. She pictures God strengthening her and lifting up her head. She can be happy in defiance of her enemies. And she says that her mouth is open wide. And so that means that she can either have a big smile on her face despite her experiences, or that she can boldly rejoice against her enemies' efforts. But either way, God has set her up in front of her enemies. And we can think, of course, of her sister wife, I believe is the term, but I think this applies more broadly as well. Hannah recognizes that it is God who has saved her, and so she thanks him. This is not just reflecting that her situation is better, but she understands that it's only by God's hand that this has changed, and that he has removed her dishonor. She sees that God has corrected the situation and exalted the lowly. And we see that in her reflections on her own experience in verses 1 and 2. She says in verse 2, and this is really poetic, and you might have seen this on posters before, that God is unique and that there is no other rock like him, which is essentially he is like a mountain among all of the small rocks. There is no comparison. And when we move to the next point of this prayer, we see that the message is also that God sees what people do and he judges it. So she switches in verse 3 from talking in first person to talking about others. A warning, some guidance. And you can again see this as directed toward her enemy, and I always want to say her name wrong. Peninnah, I want to say Peniah, but I had to write it down for myself. Peninnah, who was making fun of her and chiding her for not being able to bear children for their husband. She's speaking to her, of course, but speaking more broadly as well, that this is a lesson to anyone who would stand up against God. Don't brag about what you've done or act as if you've got the power to produce all these outcomes, because the Lord is a God of knowledge. He's all-knowing, or we would say omniscient. He sees what people do, whether that's what we're doing or what people are doing against us. And in the context, Hannah prays that people not be arrogant and think that they can control things, because God can change that in an instant. If we put this in the perspective of her situation, how many years had she gone where she couldn't bear a child for her husband? And in that culture, she would have been so dishonored for that, and that her line was going to die, and that she was dishonoring her husband. But God completely flips that. And who would have thought that that would happen? So all those who would brag and boast as if they knew what was going to happen, this is a warning of saying, don't say that, because only God knows. This is, in a lot of ways, if we move to verses 4 through 8, leading into this idea of divine reversals, I think is the best way to put it. Another part of the message of this being divine reversals is that God has sovereign power over life, over death, over prosperity, over the earth. There's a whole list of things that are given here. In that vein, the prayer also teaches, in addition to God judging and seeing, that God has the power to change things, and that no one can resist that. If you look at verses 4 through 8 and the examples that are given, the mighty are shattered, but the weak are strengthened. The wealthy turn into hungry, and the hungry are satisfied. The barren bear full numbers of children, and those who bear children become forlorn or empty or despondent. And so we see that the point is God has power over everything. There's not anything that doesn't fall within his scope of knowledge, of understanding, of sovereignty. And we notice, as we said we said earlier, that because of this repetition of his name, that being the key, verses 6 through 10 become the focus of this prayer, I would say. Here's the focus of her prayer in verses 6 through 10, which you can tell by the repetition of the name the Lord and he at the beginning of most lines here, that this is centering on God. And it's been said that this is possibly the most concentrated passage of the name of God in the Old Testament. We see in verse 6 that God has power over life and death. We see that God has power over poverty and prosperity, over honor and dishonor, that he lifts the needy out of their need and dishonor to be exalted, because he is the one who set the world and rules it, as you see in verse 8. Now, all of this goes toward the end. As we said, we talked about past experience, current workings, and then future conditions, where we also see the message that all things work toward his plan. And that is one thing that Hannah learned. All things work toward his plan in his power. He watches and protects the steps of the godly, in verse 9. And I thought of this as, if you trace really what this language is talking about, kind of like you'll see Andrew and Addie do with Ezra now, where they watch the way that he walks and make sure that he doesn't fall or go the wrong way. And that is the picture of what God is doing here for us. He's watching our steps. He's guarding us. He's making sure we don't falter. That's what God does for us. We also see, in addition, that the wicked will be silenced because no one's strength can stand against God. It's not by their strength that they can prevail, it's God's allowing. People can only prosper because of what is called God's common grace. The fact that He lets us live on this planet, that He's created this universe for us to dwell in, that we have access to food and water and the sun is shining, and all of those things that we take for granted, which are God's common graces. It closes with this idea that anyone who fights against God will be broken to pieces or shattered. People who fight against God will lose, and they will be judged, but God will strengthen His anointed. And so you can see that there is a lot of stuff packed into this. It is very poetic. It's long. I think I saw somewhere 120 words, something like that. So this is a beautiful, complex prayer that Hannah brought before the Lord and thanking Him for what He did. And we see the message of the prayer in the way that it moves and the things that it speaks toward in Hannah's own life. But considering these main messages, what are some applications for us then? And so that's the next things that we're going to talk about is lessons for us. The first thing, if we look at all of this, is we can learn that God sees what happens to us. So like He paid attention to Hannah's circumstances, He sees ours. I wonder how often she thought that God had forgotten her. And it does say that God closed her womb, and I think she later figures out that that was for a reason. It wasn't just arbitrary. But how often did she think that everyone forgot her? That God didn't understand what Peninnah was doing to her, what Eli and his sons were doing in being terrible shepherds for their people. God sees what happens to us. He pays attention to our circumstances like He did to hers. And if even people brag about what they can do, God is the one who knows what will happen. And God is the one who is weighing people's actions. And He understands that. He sees what happens to us. And so if we take this and we look at Hannah's prayer and we internalize it for ourselves, we need to realize that you are not forgotten. And that there is no one like God who is listening to you and sees what people are doing and understands the pain that we go through. And He has a plan. We also see as a lesson that God has control over everything. God's sovereignty is very central to Hannah's prayer here. He can change circumstances like He did with Hannah, or like described in this prayer where He can change the way that people are living, whether they're poor or mighty or full, or whether they're alive or dead. He can change all those things. He can stop the sun. He can part seas. There's nothing that God can't do. And so sometimes we wonder, but can He make any differences in my life? If He can do all those things, if He can raise the dead, if He can seat His Son on the throne of heaven, there's nothing that He can't do for us. Nothing is outside His power. God has control over all things. And God can use my situation for His glory. I think Hannah realizes that. That is in her prayer here. That her situation looked bad. It was completely reversed to the point where she could rejoice over her enemies only because of what God had done. And sometimes bad things do happen. And that is just because sometimes things just happen. But our circumstance always fits into God's plan. I don't necessarily mean that if something bad happens to you that God directly caused it. But even with that bad thing happening to you, it is still in God's plan. It is under His control. And I often don't understand exactly how that is or what that works to or what that's going to look like, but I try to remember for myself that He knows more than I do. I might have questions and not understand how could God possibly use this, but He knows more than I do. He has something, as verse 3 said, He knows and He weighs the deeds. He understands what people are doing. He's the one with the knowledge. Nothing is outside his power. And we can also see God will always win. Human strength will not prevail. No matter who is talking or bragging or who's in power or who's rising or doing something special, they cannot do anything against God. And there have been kings and empires and all kinds of people who have tried and failed and have been forgotten in history. He's shown his victory over everything, in changing things in the earth and the cosmos, in raising people from the dead and healing diseases, in curing people's souls. There's nothing that can be done to stand against God. And that's a good thing. That should not be a scary thing. It reminds me of a couple passages, these lessons for us, that God sees what happens to us, that he has control over everything, that he will always win. And I was thinking, is this reflected anywhere in the New Testament? I think there's multiple places, but it reminded me of these two passages in particular. In Ephesians chapter 1, talking about the panoply of promises and things that we have inherited by God's plan. It says, in him we were also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. No matter what happens, it is going to fit into God's plan. He can handle it. And in Romans 8:28, the famous one that we know, and I feel like maybe sometimes misunderstand, and I don't think I understand everything about this. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So whatever is happening to me, God is going to work it for good. And that might not be what I expect or what I want, but it is part of his plan, part of his glory, part of the plan for his people. And so one thing that we need to do is let's thank God for what he does. Let's thank him for his sovereign power and meditate on how he works. And that's one of the things that Hannah does for us here, is teaches us some deep truths about how God works in this world. And when you put all of this together, I think it's really powerful to investigate how this prayer then fits into the book and points to God's plan. So if you step back and think about it, at this point in Israel's history, where are they? They're coming off of the judges. And now Eli's family is there. And how's that going? Not well. They were in a bad situation. And so at the beginning of this story, if you look, the first thing in 1 Samuel that's really talked about is the family situation and Samuel coming to be born and obviously establishing Samuel as God's prophet. At the beginning of this story, which continues through 2 Samuel and really through the books of the Kings, God chooses this one woman through whom he will reverse her situation, and by doing that, reverse the situation of Israel. That he'll take them out of the mess that they're in and put them on a path, bringing her son Samuel, who will get the ball rolling in the right direction as a good judge and a good prophet, and raise up King David, who is a big focus of those books, whose throne is established forever, and eventually brings the Messiah, all through this one woman's experiences. And when you think about that deeply and you understand that God chose this seemingly one random woman who was dishonored and forgotten, and he lifted her up, and he changed her circumstance, and he used it to his glory, eventually bringing the Messiah through what happened to her, is absolutely beautiful. Her own experiences, I would say, seem to be a symbol for the bigger picture of what's happening in the nation. And this prayer points us to how God works and how he changes things according to his sovereign plan, to his glory. If you look at it in verse 10, there's a lot of disagreement about this, but in verse 10 she speaks, The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. There's a lot of disagreement and argument about who exactly she's talking about, but she may be prophesying about Jesus here. She may be looking forward to the fact that this is what God did, this is what he's doing in the world, and this is where it's headed. That he will raise up this anointed, that he will give strength to his king. And did we ever expect to find something like that in a package like this? But you might ask, okay, why did God change Hannah's situation, but he's not changing mine? Why are my experiences not different? Why is my situation not reversed? I don't know. I really don't. But we should remember that God is in ultimate control and that there is a plan that will account for everything that happens and that has happened in our lives. And maybe 5 years down the road it looks different. Or maybe you realize at the end of your life that there was a point in it and it shouldn't have changed. But if we all look at the pattern of our lives, I think we would all see that when we've been faithful to God, and sometimes even when we haven't been faithful to God, he has still found a way to lift us up out of the dust and to make something out of our lives. That's true for me. I would imagine that it's true for you at least once. And so as we think about this and round it all up and we're moving into our invitation here, I hope you've learned something about God tonight that deepens your relationship with him, that you can see reflected in, I think, a great forgotten text. And if you are not in a place where you can know that you have a glorifying relationship with God, then he is inviting you to come and know him. He put these things here so that we can know who he is, so that we can have access to him. And he desires a relationship with you. He worked out plans like these and ultimately brought Jesus, who shows how far God was willing to go for you to know him and to have a relationship with him. And by the way, he was willing to go all the way. And that's what he did. So for everyone here, please think seriously about that. And realize the importance of coming to know God, who knows all and controls all and can save you completely. And whether you need to confess something or to be baptized or you just want to talk, then you can let us know as we sing this song that Zach has selected.